He didn't invite her back to remember the past. He invited her to erase it. The ballroom shimmered under warm amber lights, crystal chandeliers scattering reflections across polished marble floors as laughter rose in controlled waves, the kind that belonged to people who had something to prove or something to hide. At the center of it all stood Daniel Brooks, glass of bourbon in hand, posture relaxed, smile sharpened just enough to feel intentional, his voice carrying easily over the soft hum of conversation as he tapped the microphone once, twice, drawing attention like a man who had done this before, like a man who enjoyed it. "You know," he began, his tone light but edged, "there's always that one person from your past you're glad you left behind." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, polite at first, uncertain, until his eyes shifted, deliberate, precise, landing on her. Naomi Carter stood near the back of the room, just beyond the reach of the brightest lights, her black dress simple, tailored, absorbing the glow rather than reflecting it, as if it belonged to her rather than the room. She hadn't moved since he started speaking. Not when heads turned. Not when whispers formed like static around her name. Not when someone quietly lifted a phone, the red dot of a live stream blinking to life. Daniel smiled wider, sensing the shift, feeding on it. "Naomi," he said, stretching her name just enough to make it a performance. "Why don't you come up here? It's been a while. I'm sure everyone would love to hear what you've been up to." The invitation wasn't an invitation. It was a spotlight. A stage he had already built, already scripted. For a moment, nothing happened. The music in the background seemed to fade, replaced by the soft clink of glasses being set down, chairs adjusting, breaths held just a second longer than usual. Naomi didn't rush. She didn't hesitate either. She simply stepped forward, one measured step at a time, heels quiet against the marble, her posture straight, her gaze level, not searching, not avoiding, just steady. The camera followed her now, zoom tightening, comments beginning to flicker across the unseen screen, strangers becoming witnesses to a moment they didn't understand but felt drawn to anyway. Daniel watched her approach, confidence settling deeper into his shoulders, his fingers tightening slightly around his glass, as if bracing for a reaction he was certain would come. Anger, embarrassment, anything that would justify the narrative he had already decided was true. But Naomi's face revealed nothing. No tension in her jaw, no flicker in her eyes, just a calm that didn't belong in a room built for spectacle. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough for the light to finally reach her fully, and for the first time, the room seemed to notice something it hadn't before. Not what she wore, not where she had been, but how completely she was unaffected by the space he controlled. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his smile sharpening again, adjusting his grip on the moment. "Go ahead," he said, offering her the microphone with a casual gesture that felt rehearsed. "Tell them what you became after me." The words hung there, heavy, expectant, the kind of silence that usually breaks people. But Naomi didn't reach for the microphone. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't even look at Daniel. Instead, her eyes shifted, past him, toward the entrance of the ballroom, as if she was waiting for something, or someone, that no one else had noticed yet. And for the first time that night, the man holding the microphone felt something unfamiliar press quietly against his certainty, the sense that he might not be the one controlling how this story ends. The microphone remained suspended between them, Daniel's hand steady, but his eyes narrowing just enough to betray the first crack in his control as Naomi's silence stretched longer than anyone expected, long enough for the room to begin shifting in its seats, long enough for the laughter to fade into something uncertain, something watchful, and still she did not take it, still she did not give him what he wanted, because she had learned a long time ago that reacting was a luxury she could not afford back when everything she had was tied to him, back when she used to stand beside him in rooms just like this one, wearing dresses he picked, smiling at people who only remembered her name because it came after his, back when her world had been measured by his approval and his absence. And for a brief second the past flickered through her mind not as pain, but as something distant, like a photograph left too long in the sun, faded at the edges but still recognizable. The night he told her she was holding him back, the way he did not raise his voice, did not need to, because disappointment spoken softly cuts deeper than anger ever could, the way. She had nodded as if she understood, even when her chest felt too tight to breathe. even when she knew that the life she had built around him was already collapsing in silence. And the room around her now felt eerily similar, filled with people watching, waiting, expecting her to break in a way that would make sense to them, that would confirm the version of her they had already accepted. But Naomi had spent too many early mornings alone, too many quiet hours rebuilding pieces no one else could see, to give that version of herself one more moment of truth, her fingers resting loosely at her sides, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, as if the weight of the room did not belong to her anymore, as if it had been returned to the one who created it. And Daniel felt it, even if he could not name it yet, felt the shift in the air, the subtle withdrawal of the crowd's certainty, the way attention no longer moved with him but hovered somewhere between them, unpredictable, unclaimed, his smile tightening as he let out a short, controlled laugh, the kind meant to pull the room back under his command. What? Nothing to say, he added, tilting his head, trying again, pushing just a little harder, because that had always worked before, because pressure had always made people reveal themselves. But Naomi did not move, did not blink, her gaze still directed past him, not dismissive, not defiant, just focused on something beyond the performance he was trying to maintain. And a few people near the entrance began to turn, subtle at first, a glance over the shoulder, a pause mid-conversation, as if something had entered the space without announcing itself, something that did not need attention but naturally drew it. And the live stream camera shifted slightly, adjusting to the movement, the comments beginning to change tone from amusement to curiosity, because something was happening that did not follow the expected script, and Daniel noticed it too, the way eyes were no longer locked on him, the way the room seemed to be responding to a presence he had not planned for, his grip on the microphone tightening just a fraction, his posture stiffening as he resisted the instinct to turn around, because turning would mean acknowledging that he was no longer in control of the moment. And that was something he had never allowed himself to do, not in business, not in life. Not even when he walked away from Naomi believing he was stepping into something greater, something more aligned with the image he wanted to project. But standing there now, with her silence holding stronger than any words he could throw at it, he began to sense something unfamiliar pressing closer. The realization that whatever she was waiting for was already here, and it was about to change everything he thought he understood about who had the last word. The shift became undeniable when the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened without ceremony, not with the dramatic force of someone demanding attention, but with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to. And for a brief moment the movement was almost invisible, a subtle interruption in the rhythm of the room, yet it carried a weight that drew eyes one by one, like a current pulling focus away from the center where Daniel still stood, holding on to a moment that was already slipping from his control. And Naomi saw it before anyone else did, not because she was searching for it, but because she had been expecting it, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, as if everything unfolding was simply arriving exactly when it was meant to. And the man who stepped inside did not rush, did not hesitate, his pace measured, each step deliberate against the polished floor, the soft echo of his shoes barely audible, yet somehow louder than the laughter that had filled the room. Just minutes ago, his presence carrying a quiet authority that did not need introduction, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit with effortless precision, his posture relaxed but grounded, as if every space he entered adjusted itself around him rather than the other way around. And conversations began to dissolve mid-sentence, replaced by a silence that spread gradually, almost respectfully, the kind of silence people fall into when they recognize something important without being told. And Daniel felt it too. The way the room was no longer responding to him, the way attention had shifted behind him in a direction he had not planned for, his jaw tightening slightly as he finally turned, unable to ignore it any longer. And when he did, the confidence he had been holding on to flickered, just for a second, just enough to register recognition before he could mask it again, because he knew that face, not personally, not intimately, but professionally, the kind of recognition built over meetings, emails, company briefings, the kind that carried consequences. And the man continued walking forward, not toward the stage, not toward Daniel, but toward Naomi, as if the rest of the room was incidental, as if the only person who mattered had already been decided long before he stepped through those doors. and Naomi did not move to meet him. She did not step forward or raise her hand. She simply stood where she was, grounded, certain, allowing the distance between them to close on its own, and something in that stillness made the moment feel less like a surprise and more like a conclusion that had been waiting to arrive. And the live stream camera shifted again, struggling to keep up with the change in focus, comments accelerating, confusion turning into speculation, because the narrative that had been so clear a few minutes ago was beginning to unravel in real time. And Daniel swallowed once, subtle but noticeable, his fingers tightening around the microphone as he watched the man approach, his mind racing through possibilities, through context, through every interaction he had ever had that might explain why this person was here, why he was walking toward Naomi, why the room felt like it was rearranging itself around a truth Daniel had not been prepared to face. And when the man finally stopped beside her, he did not look at Daniel first. He did not acknowledge the stage or the audience or the camera. He simply turned slightly toward Naomi, his expression softening in a way that did not belong to public performance, but to something quieter, more personal. And in that small shift, without a single word spoken, the balance of the entire room tilted, because for the first time that night, it was clear that Naomi had not been standing there alone. The room did not return to its previous rhythm, not after he arrived, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone by a joke or a raised glass, or even the microphone still hanging awkwardly in Daniel's hand. And for the first time that night, the man who had orchestrated the entire moment found himself reacting instead of leading, his posture adjusting almost imperceptibly as he watched the interaction unfolding just a few feet away from him. Naomi still, composed, still grounded, her presence no longer framed by his narrative but by something entirely her own. And the man beside her, Alexander Hayes, carried none of the urgency that usually accompanies public appearances, no need to announce himself, no attempt to command the room, because the room was already adjusting to him without being told, a subtle straightening of shoulders, a quiet recalibration of attention, as if everyone present recognized that whatever they had been watching before was no longer the main event. And Naomi's fingers moved slightly, not reaching out, not signaling, just a small shift that met his presence halfway. And when his hand found hers, it was not dramatic, not possessive, just natural, familiar, as if it had happened 1,000 times before in spaces where no one else was watching. And that single gesture carried more weight than any introduction ever could, because it was not about proving anything. It was about confirming something that already existed, and Daniel saw it, felt it. The way the connection between them required no explanation, and it unsettled him more than any words she could have spoken, because it removed him entirely from the equation. And for a brief second, he searched for something to reclaim the moment, his voice clearing as he forced a laugh that sounded thinner now, less certain. "Well," he said, lifting the microphone slightly as if to anchor himself again. "Looks like you brought company." But the line landed differently than he expected, not as a continuation of control, but as an interruption of something he did not understand, and a few people near the front exchanged glances, their attention no longer fixed on Daniel but flickering between him and the man standing beside Naomi, recognition beginning to form in quiet, unspoken ways, because Alexander Hayes was not a stranger in their world, not entirely. His name had appeared in articles, in business headlines, in conversations that carried a different kind of weight, the kind that influenced decisions beyond social gatherings and polite conversations, and Daniel knew it now with absolute clarity, the recognition settling fully into place as memory aligned with reality. Meetings he had attended, emails he had read, company announcements that suddenly felt closer than they should have, and his grip on the microphone tightened again, not out of confidence, but out of something closer to instinct, as if holding on to it might prevent the moment from slipping further away, and yet it already had. Because Alexander did not acknowledge the microphone, did not engage with the performance Daniel was trying to sustain. Instead, his attention remained on Naomi, his voice low when he finally spoke, calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach her without needing to reach anyone else. "Ready?" he asked, a simple question that carried no pressure, no expectation, only choice. And Naomi's response was just as quiet, just as steady, a small nod that said everything she had refused to say before. And in that exchange, something closed. Something that had been left unfinished for far too long, not with confrontation, not with explanation, but with a clarity that did not require either. And Daniel stood there, the microphone still in his hand, the room no longer responding to him the way it had only minutes ago. Because the story he had tried to control had moved on without him, and for the first time, he was no longer the one deciding how it would be told. The question lingered between them for only a fraction of a second, but it carried the weight of everything Naomi had rebuilt in silence. And when she nodded, it was not just an answer to him. It was an answer to a version of herself that had once stood in rooms like this waiting for permission to leave. And this time, there was no hesitation, no glance back toward Daniel. No need to acknowledge the stage that had been set for her humiliation, because the moment had already outgrown him. And as Alexander's hand remained steady in hers, she turned slightly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal movement. And that subtle shift broke whatever fragile hold Daniel still had on the room. Conversations that had paused now dissolved completely, replaced by a quiet awareness that something significant was unfolding without a single raised voice. And the livestream camera followed instinctively, drifting away from Daniel, away from the microphone, toward the two figures who were no longer performing for anyone. And Daniel felt it in a way that was impossible to ignore, the loss of attention more jarring than any direct confrontation. His mouth opening slightly, as if to speak again, to reclaim the narrative, to pull the focus back where he believed it belonged. But the words did not come as easily now, because nothing in front of him was responding the way it should have. And for the first time, uncertainty began to replace the certainty he had carried into the night. "Naomi," he called out, his voice sharper now, less controlled, not loud enough to cause a scene, but enough to cut through the quiet. And for a moment, just a moment, the room held its breath again, waiting to see if she would turn, if she would give him one last acknowledgement, one last reaction to justify everything he had set in motion. But she did not stop, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, the sound of her heels steady against the marble floor as she moved forward, not away from him, but beyond him. And that distinction settled heavily in the space between them, because leaving could be interpreted as retreat, but this was something else entirely. This was movement without resistance, without urgency, without fear, and Alexander matched her pace effortlessly, not guiding, not leading, simply present beside her, his attention still centered on her rather than the room they were leaving behind. And as they moved closer to the exit, the subtle reactions around them became more visible. A man near the bar straightening as recognition deepened, a woman lowering her phone as if realizing she was witnessing something that no longer belonged on a screen, whispers forming not about Naomi's past, but about the man beside her, about the implications of his presence, about connections that extended far beyond the reunion. And Daniel heard fragments of it, enough to piece together what he had already begun to suspect, enough to understand that this was not a coincidence, that whatever Naomi had become, whoever she had become it with, existed in a world he had only ever tried to reach. And the realization did not come with a single dramatic moment, but with a slow, tightening awareness that the roles he had assigned were no longer valid, that the story he had written had shifted without his permission. And as Naomi and Alexander reached the edge of the ballroom, the doors opening once more to let in the cooler air of the hallway beyond, she paused briefly, not to look back, not to reconsider, but simply because there was nothing left in the room that required her presence. And in that stillness, the silence behind her spoke louder than any applause ever could, because no one laughed now, no one filled the space with easy noise, they only watched. And Daniel remained where he was, the microphone still in his hand, the center of the room no longer centered on him, realizing too late that the moment he had created to diminish her had instead revealed something he could not control, something he could not undo, something that had been built far beyond his reach while he was busy believing she had nothing left. The hallway beyond the ballroom felt quieter, not because it was empty, but because the noise behind them no longer followed, as if the moment they had just walked through had sealed itself off, leaving only the soft echo of footsteps and the distant hum of air conditioning in its place. And Naomi exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of completion, the kind that does not arrive all at once but settles gently into the space where tension used to live, her hand still in Alexander's, not clinging, not needing reassurance, just present, the connection between them steady and unspoken, and for a few seconds neither of them said anything, because there was nothing urgent left to resolve, nothing to defend, nothing to prove, and that silence felt different from the one she had carried years ago, back when silence meant swallowing words, holding back reactions, shrinking herself to fit into expectations that were never designed for her. But this silence was chosen, intentional, filled with something quiet and certain, and she allowed herself to feel it fully, the cool air against her skin, the slight shift of fabric as she moved, the grounding rhythm of her own steps as they continued down the corridor. And Alexander glanced at her briefly, not searching for explanation, not asking for details, just acknowledging the moment in the same way he always had, with a calm presence that never demanded more than she was willing to give. And that had been the difference from the beginning, not grand gestures, not dramatic declarations, but the absence of pressure, the absence of expectation that she needed to be anything other than exactly who she was. And her mind drifted, not back to the ballroom, not to Daniel, but to the quiet spaces that had come before this night. The early mornings when the city was still waking up, when she would sit by the window with a cup of coffee, sunlight cutting across the table in thin golden lines, her laptop open, her focus steady, building something piece by piece without an audience, without applause, without anyone to validate the progress except herself, the long hours that did not feel heavy because they belonged to her, the small victories that no one else noticed but meant everything because they proved she could move forward without looking back. And then the day she met Alexander, not in a place designed for spectacle, but in a setting so ordinary it almost felt forgettable, a brief exchange that did not carry the weight of expectation, a conversation that did not revolve around who she used to be, but who she was becoming. And he never asked for the story she had left behind, never tried to fill in the gaps with assumptions. He simply treated her as if her present was enough, and that quiet respect had done more for her than any apology ever could, because it allowed her to exist without explanation. And as they reached the end of the corridor, the elevator doors reflecting a faint, distorted image of them standing side by side, she caught a glimpse of herself, not the version that had once been defined by someone else's choices, but someone entirely self-contained, composed, grounded in a way that did not depend on the room she had just left or the people still inside it. And when the doors opened with a soft chime, she stepped forward without hesitation, Alexander following beside her. And just before the doors closed again, sealing the space between where she had been and where she was going, there was no dramatic final look, no lingering attachment to the past, only a quiet understanding that whatever had been left unresolved no longer needed resolution, because she had already moved beyond it long before she ever walked back into that room. The elevator doors closed with a soft, definitive sound, sealing off the last trace of the room behind them. And for a moment, the silence inside felt almost weightless, untouched by the tension that had filled the ballroom just minutes before, as if the world they had stepped into operated on a different rhythm entirely, slower, steadier, unbothered by the need for performance. And Naomi stood still, her reflection faintly mirrored in the brushed steel walls, her posture relaxed but grounded, her breathing even, as though the entire evening had been nothing more than a page she had already turned long ago. And Alexander remained beside her, his presence calm, unobtrusive, never pressing into her space yet never distant, a balance that had once felt unfamiliar to her but now felt natural in a way she no longer questioned. And as the elevator began its descent, the soft hum beneath their feet marking each passing floor, she allowed her gaze to rest forward, not searching, not drifting, simply present. And for the first time that night, there was no audience, no expectation, no lingering weight from the past attempting to pull her backward, only the quiet clarity of where she stood now. And after a few seconds, Alexander spoke, his voice low. And even, you handled that exactly the way I knew you would. Not as praise, not as surprise, but as a statement of fact, something he had never doubted. And Naomi let the words settle without rushing to respond, because she understood what he meant, Not just about the moment they had left behind, but about everything that had led up to it. The years where silence had been mistaken for weakness, where walking away had been interpreted as loss, when in reality it had been the beginning of something far more deliberate, far more powerful than anything she could have proven in that room. And she finally turned her head slightly toward him, her expression calm, a faint trace of something softer in her eyes. "It was never about him," she said, her voice steady, carrying no bitterness, no need to revisit what had already been resolved within her long before tonight. And Alexander gave a small nod, not because he needed confirmation, but because he understood the difference between closure that is forced and closure that is earned. And the elevator slowed, the numbers above the door counting down until they reached the ground floor. And when the doors opened again, the cool night air filtered in, carrying the distant sounds of the city, passing cars, faint conversations, the steady rhythm of a world that moved forward without pause. And Naomi stepped out without hesitation, her heels meeting the pavement with quiet certainty, the streetlights casting a soft glow that felt less like a spotlight and more like a continuation of her own presence. And behind them, far above, the reunion continued without them. But it no longer held any relevance. No unfinished threads, no unresolved tension, only a memory that had already lost its weight the moment she chose not to carry it anymore. And as they walked toward the waiting car at the curb, Alexander opened the door without a word, a simple gesture that carried none of the showmanship of the evening they had just left, only consistency, only respect. And Naomi paused for just a fraction of a second before getting in, not to look back, not to reconsider, but because she understood that this moment was not an escape, it was a transition she had already completed within herself. And when she finally took her seat, the city lights reflecting softly against the window, there was no sense of victory in the way most people would define it. No need to measure what had happened in comparison to what she had lost, because what she had gained existed on an entirely different scale, one that could not be seen from a stage or captured through a camera. And as the car pulled away from the curb, blending into the quiet flow of the night, the story that had once been defined by someone else's perception no longer belonged to them at all, because she had rewritten it without ever needing to say a single word. Inside the moving car, the city unfolded in quiet streaks of light beyond the window, each passing street lamp casting brief reflections across Naomi's face, soft and fleeting, like moments that no longer needed to be held onto. And she sat back against the seat, her posture relaxed, her hands resting calmly in her lap, not gripping, not tense, just still in a way that came from certainty rather than exhaustion. And the silence between her and Alexander was not empty. It carried a quiet understanding, the kind that did not demand conversation to prove its presence. And for a while neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to dissect, nothing left to analyze about what had just happened, the significance of it settling naturally without the need for explanation. And outside, the city continued its steady rhythm, cars passing, distant headlights blending into a soft stream of motion, the world moving forward exactly as it always had, untouched by the moment that had just reshaped everything for one person who no longer needed it to. And Naomi's gaze remained forward, not lost in thought, not searching for meaning, simply present, because she had already done the work long before tonight, the kind of work no one applauds, the kind that happens in silence, in early mornings and late nights, in decisions made when no one is watching. And that was why the room had never stood a chance against her, because it had been built on perception while she had rebuilt herself on something real. And Alexander glanced at her briefly, his expression composed, as if confirming something he had always known rather than discovering it. And after a moment, he spoke, his tone even, grounded. "They will talk about tonight for a long time." Not as a prediction meant to impress, but as a simple observation of how people process what they do not understand. And Naomi allowed the words to settle before responding, her voice calm, almost distant. "They can have it," she said, not dismissive, not indifferent, just clear, because whatever version of her existed in that room no longer belonged to her. It belonged to them, to their assumptions, to their need to frame the moment into something they could explain, and she had no interest in correcting it, no need to rewrite their understanding. because her life was no longer built on being understood by people who had never seen her fully in the first place. And the car slowed slightly as it approached an intersection, the red light casting a soft glow through the windshield, painting everything in a muted, steady hue. And for a brief second, the stillness returned, mirroring the pause she had carried within herself before stepping into that ballroom earlier that night. Except now it felt different, lighter, not waiting for something to happen, but simply existing without pressure. And across the city, far above in that same ballroom, the narrative was already shifting without her, voices lowering into speculation, questions forming that no one could answer with certainty. Daniel's name now spoken in a different tone, one that carried less authority, less control, because the image he had tried to present had fractured in a way that could not be easily repaired, not because of anything she had said, but because of what she had refused to say. And back in the car, Naomi did not think about that, did not imagine the conversations or the reactions, because none of it had the power it once did. None of it reached into the life she had built beyond their reach. And as the light turned green and the car moved forward again, merging seamlessly into the flow of the night, there was no sense of unfinished business, no lingering attachment to what had been left behind. Only the quiet certainty that the chapter had already ended long before anyone else realized it. And now, finally, everyone else had simply caught up. The car moved steadily through the city, blending into the quiet rhythm of late evening traffic, and Naomi watched the reflections slide across the window without following them, without attaching meaning to any passing image, because for the first time in a long time, nothing outside of her required interpretation, nothing demanded her attention in a way that pulled her away from herself. And that stillness was not emptiness. It was clarity, the kind that only comes after everything unnecessary has been stripped away. And beside her, Alexander remained composed, his presence unchanged, not asking questions, not revisiting the night, because he understood something that few people ever did, that the most important moments are not the ones that are explained, but the ones that are lived fully and then released without needing to be retold. And as the car turned onto a quieter street lined with soft pools of light from evenly spaced street lamps, Naomi allowed her gaze to settle inward for just a moment, not to revisit the past, but to acknowledge the distance she had traveled from it, the version of herself who once stood in silence because she felt small, because she believed that speaking would not change anything, because she thought that being left behind meant she had nothing left to offer, and she almost smiled at the memory, not out of regret, not out of bitterness, but out of recognition, because that version of her had been necessary, that silence had been the ground she built on, not the place she remained. And the difference now was not that she had something to prove, it was that she no longer needed to. And the car slowed as it approached their destination, the building rising ahead with clean lines and quiet elegance, its entrance lit in a way that felt welcoming rather than imposing. And when the car came to a stop, there was no rush to move, no urgency to step out and mark the end of the night, because the end had already happened long before they arrived, back in that room where she chose not to react, not to defend, not to become the version of herself that had been expected. And Alexander stepped out first, the door opening with a soft click before he turned back toward her, offering his hand in the same steady way he always had, not as a gesture meant to impress, but as something consistent, something real. And Naomi accepted it, stepping out onto the pavement with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through the entire evening. And for a brief moment, they stood there under the soft glow of the entrance lights, the city continuing around them without interruption.